Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you guys really enjoyed the last kind of final-centric daily fantasy basketball report. It has been a true honor to get to present to you these different series, these different players stepping up in the postseason in terms of fantasy. So, I'm just happy now that the season has ended and my Boston Celtics are NBA champions. Looking ahead to the fantasy basketball campaign for next year, it should be a fantastic one. But for now, let's switch to hockey. But before we do that, I want to remind you yet again to consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated. Huge support to the network, both me and my fellow podcasters. So do consider that. Without further ado, let's jump right into potentially the last transition between basketball and hockey we have on the show. For quite some time, we are previewing the Stanley Cup Finals Game 5 between the Florida Panthers and the Edmonton Oilers after the Edmonton Oilers shockingly extended this series in a complete and utter demolition of the Florida Panthers at home in Edmonton. But now the series goes back to Florida, and that's what really concerns me. But before we get into my concerns, let's look at what Daily Fantasy is projecting for this game. Obviously, the top price man is Connor McDavid after a stellar performance in Game 4, sitting at 11.4K in Daily Fantasy, projected to have 17.9 fantasy points, a lofty standard for one of the best players in the world. In terms of the Florida Panthers, they just need their players to bounce back, and so I'm just going to give you guys two of my bounce-back candidates for the Florida Panthers here. In Sam Bennett, 7.4K valuation, 11 fantasy points projected for him. And then Anton Lundell had a great Game 3, kind of a lower-level center, lower line center, 5.2K for him. And then he's projected to have 6.9 fantasy points, so kind of a little nice utility option to consider for tonight. And then in terms of Edmonton, how about Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, one of the longest tenured Edmonton Oilers on the squad, 7.6K valuation, 7.2. Look for him to really combine with Connor McDavid and want to get off on the right foot as the series shifts back to Florida. Now let's talk about that series shift because it's a huge one. I mentioned before in previous episodes how the distance between these two teams, no matter how much they try to keep their upbeat mood, that distance sometimes creates a mental barrier. I know they try to overcome it by bonding on the plane rides over, playing games with each other. I know the Oilers have always talked about what games they play, but games don't matter when you're in the Stanley Cup Finals. Fatigue and mental fatigue definitely matter. And when you're playing in such a high-pressure situation where the stakes are so high, especially for the Edmonton Oilers as they head back to Florida, it really takes a toll on you. And we'll have to see how the Oilers come out in this Game 5 because of the fact they built a lot of momentum coming over from Game 3 to Game 4 where they utterly dominated for the first time in this series. But now they're out of that home atmosphere, that home mindset. They are back in a Florida atmosphere that really wants Florida to finish it off in 5, get it over with, win the first Stanley Cup in franchise history. And the Edmonton Oilers need to overcome whatever barrier they have put in their minds between themselves and travel and just get over the hump, try to extend the series for as long as possible. Now, another question that comes to mind is, should the Florida Panthers win this game, but Connor McDavid performs well? Does Connor McDavid win the Conn Smythe Trophy? He has inarguably been the best player not only on the Edmonton Oilers this postseason, but also in recent history, one of the best performances by a player in the Stanley Cup Finals. Now, speaking to all the records he's broken, he is the leading Edmonton Oilers point scorer. He broke, like I said, Wayne Gretzky's previous record for most assists in a single postseason, and he's just continuing to show up. He ranks 6th all-time of the all-time postseason scoring list. Just an outstanding, incredible performance from him for these Oilers to get to this point. His mindset really pushed them over the edge. And so, the big question for me is, does Connor McDavid, if he does win the Conn Smythe MVP trophy, vault himself into the status of players who can't get over the hump. Now, obviously, his championship window is extending now that the Oilers have gotten to this point, and I can see them not going anywhere for the next couple of years should they retain most of the core around McDavid and Draisaitl. So I'm really intrigued to see how voters view Connor McDavid's level of performance, especially in these past couple of games in the finals. Obviously, he didn't get off to a good start in the first couple of games, but in Edmonton, he did hit the ground running and got back to his best form. So how voters view this performance by Connor McDavid if he should lose. It has happened before. Most recent example of a player in a losing effort being dominated kind of in the finals was Reggie Leach of the Boston Bruins when they got swept by the Montreal Canadiens in '76. Reggie Leach still had a fantastic point production, over 20 points, most of them coming in the semifinals. So it kind of goes to show that voters will kind of consider that, but in order for them to consider that, Connor McDavid will really have to have a stellar performance. In terms of the Florida Panthers side of things, especially when it comes to Conn Smythe voting, I now think it is Aleksander Barkov's to lose. As the leader of this team, as one of the captains of this team, if Aleksander Barkov has a fantastic game, if he even scores like late in the game to clinch the series for Florida, I think that it is his to lose. Mainly due to the fact that Sergei Bobrovsky did have a very down game, got pulled early on in that game 4. So I do think that Aleksander Barkov, it is his for the taking. And in order for Sergei Bobrovsky to overcome that, he's going to have at least a shutout performance. Because right now, what we're looking at is if he does win the Conn Smythe MVP, we'll have the worst goals against average by a goalie in a postseason winning the Conn Smythe since an Edmonton goalie in the early 90s. So, Sergei Bobrovsky, in my mind's eye, he could definitely win it. I think he definitely has the record. He's had the performances to prove it. He has really been one of the catalysts as to why, the reasons as to why this Florida team has gotten to this point. The reason why they have really overcome so many obstacles to get here is because of Sergei Bobrovsky, them relying on Sergei Bobrovsky in tough times to get them over the hump. And so, I really feel as if, should Florida clinch it tonight, it's a two-man race, but I'm giving the favorite to this Aleksander Barkov captain because of his leadership characteristics in big moments down the stretch. Should he have a big Game 5, I'm looking for him to win the Conn Smythe. But it could change, as always. Even if Edmonton wins, I think McDavid suddenly gets vaulted up. But that should just about do it for the Conn Smythe talk here. Let's transition to the betting odds for tonight's game. So the total sits at 5.5, as always, when it comes to hockey. Edmonton is at plus 115, and Florida is at minus 135. So as you can see, yes, it has shifted to Florida as the series goes back to Florida, and they have home ice advantage now. But it hasn't shifted as much as is expected because of the Edmonton Oilers' utter dominance, and bookmakings are realizing that at this moment in time. And so I'm really split on how to view this game. I do think Florida does have the slight advantage in that Edmonton doesn't seem to get over mental fatigue in terms of travel. I think the fact that they were going to Edmonton really allowed them to rest easy, but going back to Florida, especially down 3-1 when they could have been at 2-2, I really will think will settle into their minds and they'll come out a little bit anxious to get going. And so that is why I slightly favor Florida and would pick Florida. In terms of over-under in this game, I think that it will be high scoring. I think that there will be goals. I think those two teams will go back and forth. Edmonton will want to expound every ounce of energy, much like the Dallas Mavericks did to win Game 4 in their NBA Finals series. But Edmonton really needs to prove that that game was not a fluke. Obviously, they have shown in recent memory to after losing 3 more games, to have these long streaks where they win the X amount of games and they'll just continue being the streaky team that loses some games and then goes on these long streaks. So they're going to have to prove that again. And I wouldn't put it past them, but right now it just feels like Florida's time. They're in Florida for this game. That's a huge factor for them. I think that they're going to wipe that Game 4 disaster from their minds and just come out swinging. And so I think that by tonight's end, the Florida Panthers will be hoisting the Stanley Cup trophy for the first time in their franchise history. But that will just about do it for this segment. If this is the last one, it's been a bittersweet ride, guys. Hopefully, maybe Edmonton can extend the series and I get one more fantasy preview or recap segment to do with you guys. But if this is it, it is what it is, and it's been a fantastic fantasy hockey season. I've been so glad to be a part of it with you guys. But coming up next, the moment you've all been waiting for, the seismic shift to the fantasy football realm. I'm going to discuss my fantasy running back breakout stars for next season. You don't want to miss it. We'll be right back to continue this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube.